Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor, please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round bookworms, because the time has come for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today, we'll read Chapter 2 of Elvis and Me, written by his wife, Priscilla Presley. Here we go. It was 1956. I was living with my family at the Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin, Texas, where my father, then Captain Joseph Paul Beaulieu, a career officer, was stationed. He came home late for dinner one evening and handed me a record album. "I don't know what this Elvis guy is all about," he said, "but he must be something special. I stood in line with half the Air Force at the PX to get this for you. Everybody wants it." I put the record on the hi-fi and heard the rocking music of Blue Suede Shoes. The album was titled Elvis Presley. It was his first. Like almost every other kid in America, I liked Elvis, but not as fanatically as many of my girlfriends at Del Valley Junior High. They all had Elvis t-shirts, and Elvis hats, and Elvis bobby socks, and even lipstick in colors with names like Hound Dog Orange and Heartbreak Pink. Elvis was everywhere, on bubblegum cards and Bermuda shorts, on diaries and wallets and pictures that glowed in the dark. The boys at school began trying to look like him, with their slick-back pompadours and long sideburns and turned-up collars. One girl was so crazy about him that she was running his local fan club. She said I could join for 25 cents, the price of a book she had ordered for me by mail. When I received it, I was shocked to see a picture of Elvis signing the bare chest of a couple of girls, at that time an unheard of act. Then I saw him on television on Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey's stage show. He was sexy and handsome, with his deep, brooding eyes, pouty lips, crooked smile. He strutted out to the microphone, spread his legs, leaned back, and strummed his guitar. Then he began singing with such confidence, moving his body with unbridled sexuality. Despite myself, I was attracted. Some members of his adult audience were less enthusiastic. Soon his performances were labeled obscene. My mother stated emphatically that he was a bad influence for teenage girls. He arouses things in them that shouldn't be aroused. If there's ever a mother's march against Elvis Presley, I'll be the first in line. But I had heard that despite all of his stage antics and lustful, tough guy looks, Elvis came from a strict Southern Christian background. He was a country boy who didn't smoke or drink, who loved and honored his parents, and who addressed all adults as sir or ma'am. I was an Air Force child, a shy, pretty little girl, unhappily accustomed to moving from base to base every 2 or 3 years. By the time I was 11, I had lived in 6 different cities, and fearful of not being accepted, I either kept to myself or waited for someone to befriend me. I found it especially difficult entering a new school in the middle of the year, when cliques had already been established and newcomers were considered outsiders. Small and petite, with long brown hair, blue eyes, and an upturned nose, I was always stared at by the other students. At first, girls would see me as a rival, afraid I'd take their boyfriends away. I seemed to feel more comfortable with boys, and they were usually friendlier. People always said that I was the prettiest girl in school, but I never felt that way. I was skinny, practically scrawny, and even if I was as cute as people said, I wanted to have more than just good looks. Only with my family did I really feel totally protected and loved. Close and supportive, They provided my stability. A photographer's model before her marriage, my mother was totally devoted to her family. As the oldest, it was my responsibility to help her with the kids. After me, there was Dawn, 4 years my junior, and Michelle, my only sister, who was 5 years younger than Dawn. Jeff and the twins, Tim and Tom, hadn't yet been born. My mother was too shy to talk about the facts of life, so my education came in school when I was in the 6th grade. Some kids were passing around a book that looked like the Bible from the outside, but when you opened it, there were pictures of men making love to women and women making love to each other. My body was changing and stirring with new feelings. I had gotten looks from boys at school, and once a picture of me in a tight turtleneck sweater was stolen from the school bulletin board. Yet, I was still a child, embarrassed about my own sexuality. I fantasized endlessly about French kissing, but when my friends who hung around our house played spin the bottle, it would take me half an hour to let a boy kiss my pursed lips. My strong, handsome father was the center of our world. He was a hard worker who had earned his degree in business administration at the University of Texas. At home, he ran a tight ship. He was a firm believer in discipline and responsibility, and he and I frequently knocked heads. When I became a cheerleader at 13, it was all I could do to convince him to let me go to out-of-town games. Other times, no amount of crying, pleading, or appealing to my mother would change his mind. When he laid down the law, that was that. I managed to get around him occasionally. When he refused to let me wear a tight skirt, I joined the Girl Scouts specifically so I could wear their tight uniform. My parents were survivors. Although they often had to struggle financially, we children were the last to feel it. When I was a little girl, my mother sewed pretty tablecloths to cover the orange crates that we used as end tables. Rather than do without, we made the best of what we had. Dinner was strictly group participation. Mother cooked, one of us set the table, and the rest cleaned up. Nobody got away with anything, but we were very supportive of one another. I felt fortunate to have a close-knit family. Going through old albums of family photographs showing my parents when they were young fascinated me. I was curious about the past. WW2 intrigued me, especially since my father had fought with the Marines on Okinawa. He looked handsome in his uniform. You could tell he was posing for my mother. But somehow, his smile looked out of place, especially when you realize where he was. When I read the note on the back of the picture about how much he missed my mother, my eyes filled with tears. While rummaging through the family keepsakes, I came upon a small wooden box. Inside was a carefully folded American flag, the kind that I knew was given to servicemen's widows. Also inside the box was a picture of my mother, with her arm around a strange man, and sitting on her lap, an infant. On the back of the photo was inscribed, "Mommy, Daddy, Priscilla." I had discovered a family secret. Feeling betrayed, I ran to phone my mother, who was at a party nearby. Within minutes, I was in her arms, crying, as she calmed me and explained that when I was 6 months old, my real father, Lieutenant James Wagner, a handsome Navy pilot, had perished in a plane crash while returning home on leave. 2.5 years later, she married Paul Beaulieu, who adopted me and had always loved me as his own. Mother suggested I keep my discovery from the other children. She felt it would endanger our family closeness, though when it did become known, it had no effect on our feelings for one another. She gave me a gold locket that my father had given her. I cherished that locket and wore it for years and fantasized that my father was a great hero. In times of emotional pain and loneliness, he would become my guardian angel. By the end of the year, I had been nominated to run for Queen of Del Valley Junior High. This was my first taste of politics and competition, and it was especially trying because I was running against Pam Rutherford, my best friend. We each had a campaign manager introducing us as we went from house to house, knocking on doors. My manager tried to talk each person into voting for me and donating a penny or more per vote to a school fund. The nominee who collected the most money won. I was sure that this competition would jeopardize my friendship with Pam, which was more important to me than winning. I considered quitting, but felt I couldn't let my parents or my supporters down. While my mother was out looking for a dress for me to wear to the coronation, my dad kept reminding me to memorize an acceptance speech. I kept putting it off, certain I was going to lose. It was the last day of the campaign, and a rumor began circulating that Pam's grandparents had put in $100 bill for their vote. My parents were disappointed. There was no way that they could afford to match that much money, and even if they could, they objected on principle. The night they announced the winner, I was all dressed up in a new turquoise blue strapless tulle net formal that itched so badly I couldn't wait to take it off. I sat beside Pam on the dais in the large school auditorium. I could see my parents with happy, confident looks on their faces, though I was sure they were going to be disheartened. Then the principal walked up to the podium. "And now," she said, hesitating to heighten the suspense, "is the moment you've all been waiting for. The culmination of a month of campaigning by our two lovely contestants, Priscilla Presley." All eyes turned toward me. I blushed and glanced at Pam. "And Pam Rutherford." Our eyes locked for a brief, tense moment. "The new queen of Del Valley Junior High is..." A drum roll sounded. "Priscilla Presley!" The audience applauded wildly. I was in shock. Called up to the stage to give my speech, I had none. Sure that I was going to lose, I never even bothered to write one. I walked trembling to the podium, then looked out at the crowded auditorium. All I could see was my father's face, growing more disappointed as he realized I had nothing to say. When I finally spoke, it was to apologize. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm not prepared to give a speech, as I did not expect to win. But thank you very much for voting for me. I'll do my very best." And then, looking at my father, I added, "I'm sorry, Dad." I was surprised as the audience graciously applauded. But I still had to face my father and hear him say, "I told you so." Being elected queen was a bittersweet victory, because the closeness that Pam and I once shared was restrained. Still, to me, that crown symbolized a wonderful, unfamiliar feeling: acceptance. My newfound tranquility ended abruptly when my father announced that he was being transferred to Wiesbaden, West Germany. I was crushed. Germany was the other side of the world. All my fears returned. My first thought was, what am I going to do about my friends? I turned to my mother, who was sympathetic, and reminded me that we were in the Air Force and moving was an unavoidable part of our lives. I finished junior high school. My mother gave birth to baby Jeff, and we said our goodbyes to neighbors and good friends. Everyone promised to write or call, but remembering past promises, I knew better. My friend Angela jokingly told me that Elvis Presley was stationed in Bad Neuheim, West Germany. "Do you believe it? You're going to be in the same country as Elvis Presley," she said. We looked at a map and found that Bad Neuheim was close to Wiesbaden. I said back, "I'm going over there to meet Elvis." We both laughed, hugged each other, and said goodbye. The 15-hour flight to West Germany seemed interminable, but finally we arrived in the beautiful old city of Wiesbaden, headquarters of the U.S. Air Force in Europe. There, we checked into the Helene Hotel, a massive and venerable building on the main thoroughfare. After 3 months, hotel living became too expensive, and we began looking for a place to rent. We felt lucky to find a large apartment in a vintage building constructed long before WW1. Soon after we moved in, we noticed that all the other apartments were rented to single girls. These Fräuleins walked around all day long in robes and negligees. Once we learned a little German, we realized that although the pension was very discreet, we were living in a bordello. Moving was out of the question. Housing was too scarce, but the location did little to help me adjust. Not only was I isolated from other American families, but there was the language barrier. I was accustomed to changing schools frequently, but a foreign country posed altogether new problems, principally that I couldn't share my thoughts. I began to feel that my life had stopped dead in its tracks. September came, and with it, school. Once again, I was the new girl. I was no longer popular and secure as I had been at Dell. There was a place called the Eagles Club, where American service families went for dinner and entertainment. It was within walking distance of the pension, and soon proved an important discovery for me. Every day after school, I'd go to the snack bar there and listen to the jukebox and write letters to my friends back home in Austin, telling them how much I missed them. Drowning in tears, I'd spend my weekly allowance playing the songs that were very popular back in the States. Frankie Avalon's Venus and the Everly Brothers' All I Have to Do Is Dream. One warm summer afternoon, I was sitting with my brother Don when I noticed a handsome man in his 20s staring at me. I had seen him watching me before, but I never paid any attention to him. This time, he stood up and walked toward me. He introduced himself as Curry Grant and asked my name. Priscilla Presley, I said, immediately suspicious. He was much older than I. He asked where in the States I came from, how I liked Germany, and if I liked Elvis Presley. Of course, I said, laughing. Who doesn't? I'm a good friend of his. My wife and I go to his house quite often. How would you like to join us one evening? Unprepared for such an extraordinary invitation, I grew even more skeptical and guarded. I told him I'd have to ask my parents. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Curry met my parents and my father checked out his credentials. Curry was also in the Air Force, and it turned out that my father knew his commanding officer. That seemed to break the ice between them. Curry assured Dad that I'd be well chaperoned when we visited Elvis, who lived off base in a house in Bad Neuheim. On the appointed night, I tore through my closet, trying to find an appropriate outfit. Nothing seemed dressy enough for meeting Elvis Presley. I settled on a navy and white sailor dress and white socks and shoes. Surveying myself in the mirror, I thought I looked cute, but being only 14, I didn't think I'd make any kind of impression on Elvis. 8 o'clock finally arrived, and so did Curry Grant and his attractive wife, Carol. Anxious, I hardly spoke to either of them during the 45-minute drive. We entered the small town of Bad Neuheim, with its narrow cobblestone streets and plain old-fashioned houses, and I kept looking around for what I assumed would be Elvis's huge mansion. Instead, Curry pulled up to an ordinary-looking 3-story house surrounded by a white picket fence. There was a sign on the gate in German, which translated as autographs between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock p.m. only. Even though it was after 8 o'clock, a large group of friendly German girls waited around expectantly. When I asked Curry about them, he explained that there was always large groups of fans outside the house, hoping to catch a glimpse of Elvis. I followed Curry through the gate and up the short pathway to the door. We were welcomed by Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, a tall, gray-haired, attractive man who led us down a long hallway to the living room, from which I could hear Brenda Lee on the record player singing Sweet Nothings. The plain, almost drab living room was filled with people, but I spotted Elvis immediately. He was handsomer than he appeared in films, younger and more vulnerable looking, with his GI haircut. He was in civilian clothes, a bright red sweater and tan slacks, and he was sitting with one leg swung over the arm of a large overstuffed chair, with a cigar dangling from his lips. As Curry led me over to him, Elvis stood up and smiled. "Well," he said, "what have we here?" I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just kept staring at him. "Elvis," Curry said, "this is Priscilla Presley, the girl I told you about." We shook hands, and he said, "Hi, I'm Elvis Presley." But then there was a silence between us until Elvis asked me to sit down beside him, and Curry drifted off. "So," Elvis said, "do you go to school?" "Yes." "What are you, about a junior or senior in high school?" I blushed and said nothing, not willing to reveal that I was only in the 9th grade. "Well," he persisted. "Ninth." Elvis looked confused. "Ninth what?" "Grade," I whispered. "9th grade," he said, and started laughing. "Why, you're just a baby." "Thanks," I said curtly. Not even Elvis Presley had the right to say that to me. "Well, seems the little girl has spunk," he said, laughing again, amused by my response. He gave me that charming smile of his, and all my resentment just melted away. We made small talk for a while longer. Then Elvis got up, walked over to the piano, and sat down. The room suddenly grew silent. Everyone's eyes were riveted on him as he began to entertain us. He sang Rags to Riches and Are You Lonesome Tonight, and then with his friends singing harmony, End of the Rainbow. He also did a Jerry Lee Lewis impersonation, pounding the keys so hard that a glass of water he'd set on the piano began sliding off. When Elvis caught it without missing a beat of the song, everybody laughed and applauded. Except me. I was nervous. I glanced around the room and saw an intimidating, life-size poster of a half-dressed Bridget Bardot on the wall. She was the last person I wanted to see, with her fulsome body, pouting lips, and wild mane of tousled hair. Imagining Elvis's taste in women, I felt very young and out of place. I glanced up and saw Elvis trying to get my attention. I noticed that the less response I showed, the more he began singing just for me. I couldn't believe that Elvis Presley was trying to impress me. Later, he asked me to come into the kitchen, where he introduced me to his grandmother, Minnie Mae Presley, who stood by the stove frying a huge pan of bacon. As we sat down at the table, I told Elvis I wasn't hungry. Actually, I was too nervous to eat. "You're the first girl I've met from the States in a long time," Elvis said, as he began devouring the first of 5 gigantic bacon sandwiches, each one smothered with mustard. "Who were the kids listening to?" I laughed. "Are you kidding?" I said. "Everyone listens to you." Elvis seemed unconvinced. He asked me a lot of questions about Fabian and Ricky Nelson. He told me he was worried about how his fans would accept him when he returned to the States. Since he had been away, he hadn't made any public appearances or movies, although he had had 5 hit singles, all recorded before he left. It felt like we had just begun talking when Curry came in and pointed to his watch. I had dreaded that moment. The evening had gone so fast. It seemed I had just arrived, and now I was being hurried away. Elvis and I had just started to get to know each other. I felt like Cinderella, knowing that when my curfew came, all this magic was end. I was surprised when Elvis asked Curry if I could possibly stay longer. When Curry explained the agreement with my father, Elvis casually suggested that maybe I could come by again. Though I wanted to more than anything in the world, I didn't really believe it would happen. The fog was so thick on the Autobahn back to Wiesbaden that I didn't get home until 2 a.m. My parents had waited up, wanting to know everything that had happened. I told them Elvis was a gentleman, that he was funny and entertained his friends all night, and that I had had a wonderful time. The next day in school, I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts were entirely on Elvis. I tried to recall every word he'd said to me, every song he had sung, every look in his eyes as he gazed at me. I went over and over our conversation. His charm was captivating. I told no one. Who would ever believe that just the night before, I had been with Elvis Presley? I never expected to hear from him again. Then, a few days later, the phone rang. It was Curry. He said he had just got a call from Elvis, who wondered if it was possible for Curry to bring me over that night. I was ecstatic. Curry, you don't mean it. He wants to see me? Why? When did he call? Unable to answer all my questions, Curry said calmly, "You want me to ask your father?" My parents were as surprised as I. They reluctantly acceded to Curry's request. The next visit was very much like the one before. Small talk, singing, Elvis playing the piano, and everyone eating Grandma's favorite dishes. But later, when Elvis had finished singing, he came up to me. "I want to be alone with you, Priscilla." We were standing face to face, staring into each other's eyes. I looked around. The room was empty. "We are alone," I replied nervously. He moved closer, backing me against the wall. "I mean really alone," he whispered. "Will you come upstairs to my room?" The question threw me into a panic. His room? Until that moment, it hadn't crossed my mind that Elvis Presley might be interested in me. He could have any girl in the world. Why would he want me? "There's nothing to be frightened of, honey." As he spoke, he was smoothing my hair. "I swear I'll never do anything to harm you." He sounded absolutely sincere. "I'll treat you just like a sister." Flustered and confused, I looked away. "Please." Standing there, looking into his eyes, I was drawn to him, almost against my will. I believed him. It wasn't a difficult thing to do. I had discovered by now his intentions were warm and sincere. Moments went by, and I still couldn't do anything. Then I nodded. "All right, I'll go." He took my hand and led me toward the stairs, whispering which room was his, and said, "You go on ahead, and I'll join you in a few minutes. It looks better." He headed toward the kitchen, as I slowly climbed the stairs, wondering, what would he demand of me? Expect of me? I will be completely alone with him for the first time. Since meeting him, I had dreamed of this moment, sure that it would never arrive. And now, I was in the midst of a reality I had never expected. I reached the second floor and found his bedroom. It was as plain and impersonal as the other rooms of the house. I went in and sat down primly on a stiff-backed chair and waited. When Elvis didn't show up after a few minutes, I began to look around. It was an ordinary room with nothing unusual, certainly nothing to imply that it belonged to a famous rock and roll singer. There were books, a collection of records, his uniform, and his boots. There were several letters from girls in the States on his night table. Many were from someone named Anita. Elvis rarely mentioned Anita, but everyone knew he had a girl back home. I wanted to read the letters, but was afraid he'd catch me. It was another 20 minutes before he finally appeared. He came in, removed his jacket, turned on the radio, and then sat down on his bed. I hardly looked at him, petrified of what he might expect. I imagined him grabbing me, throwing me down on the bed, and making love to me. Instead, he said, "Why don't you come over here and sit next to me?" I was reluctant, but he assured me that I had nothing to be afraid of. "I really like you, Priscilla. You're refreshing. It's nice to talk to someone from back home. I miss that. Gets a little lonely here." I sat next to him, saying nothing, but I was touched by his vulnerable, boyish quality. He went on to say that our relationship was going to be important to him and that he needed me. It was October, and he was scheduled to return to the States in 6 months. He knew lots of girls, he said, and many had come to visit as I had, but I was the first girl with whom he felt a real closeness. I cuddled into his arms, certain he would not move too fast. He held me closely, saying, "I just wish Mama could have been here to meet you." He sighed, and a troubled look came over his face. "She would have liked you as much as I do." "I wish I could have met her," I whispered, moved by his sincerity. I was to learn that Elvis's mother, Gladys, was the love of his life. He expressed how deeply he loved and missed her, and how in many ways he dreaded returning to Graceland without her there. It had been his gift to her, a private estate that he had purchased for $100,000 in 1957. Elvis believed that his mother had eventually given up on life. Her health had begun to deteriorate when he was drafted. Her love for Vernon and Elvis was so great that she could never face the loss of either of them, and often said she wanted to be the first to go. In Gladys's naive country way, she assumed that Germany still represented danger. She could never comprehend that peacetime conditions now prevailed. It was Elvis's habit to phone Gladys every day. I was surprised to learn that up until the time he began entertaining, he never spent a night away from home. He told me of the time his car caught on fire while on the road, and he barely escaped with his life. Although she was miles away, Gladys sat straight up in her bed and screamed his name. The intuitive link between them was that strong. Her concern for his welfare while he was away from home was so great that she would spend sleepless nights until his call came telling her he was safe. When he was in basic training in Fort Hood, Texas, he rented a house off base for Vernon, Gladys, and Grandma. I felt that losing her affected him more than anyone could fully understand. He blamed himself for not being with her when she fell ill and had to be sent back home to Memphis under a doctor's care. In time, he realized that Gladys had resorted to drinking, and he was very concerned that this could become a problem. As much as he consoled her, assured her that he would return in 18 months, and even begged her to join him, Gladys's fear of losing her only son drove her to the end. Elvis's unrelieved depression over Gladys was intensified by the conflict in Elvis's mind over Dee Stanley, whom Vernon had met in Germany. Dee and his father had become inseparable, too soon to Elvis's liking. An attractive blonde in her 30s, Dee was in the process of divorcing her husband and was separated from him and her 3 children when she started dating Vernon. The thought that his father could ever conceive of replacing Gladys upset Elvis terribly. He also had doubts about Dee's intentions and whether they were in his father's best interest. "What's Dee trying to do?" Elvis sometimes asked suspiciously. "Make him into some dude he's not? Why can't she just accept him the way he is? I've never seen him so lovesick. She meets him at some restaurant and exchanges love notes all day." My heart went out to Elvis that night as he confided his problems and worries. He was a world-famous entertainer, a great star, and yet a terribly lonely man. Again, our visit seemed to end too soon. He kissed me goodbye, my first real kiss. I had never experienced such a mixture of affection and desire. I was speechless, but closely tied to the reality of where I was, locked in his arms, my mouth against his. Aware of my response in my youth, he broke away first, saying, "We have plenty of time, little one." He kissed my forehead and sent me home. By our fourth date, Dad had laid down the law. If you want to continue seeing Elvis, we're going to have to meet him. My parents weren't so enthralled with his celebrity status that they were willing to compromise their principles. In the beginning, it was convenient for Curry to come for me and bring me home, but by now, my parents were asking why Elvis didn't do this himself. One Saturday night, I said to Elvis, "My parents want to meet you. They want you to pick me up." He bristled. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said nervously, "I can't come see you anymore unless you come and meet my parents." He agreed, provided he could bring his father along. That day I went through my usual routine, except instead of being ready 1 hour in advance, it was 2. I waited by the window, looking for his car as I played his records. Old Shep, I Was the One, and I Want You, I Need You, I Love You. Non-stop until my father yelled from the kitchen, "Do you have to play those records now? My God, the man will be here in a few minutes, and you see him practically every night. I think you'd want to take a breather from each other." I was nervous. I knew that Dad wanted Elvis to both pick me up and bring me home himself, and he planned to tell Elvis this. I didn't know how Dad was going to approach him, whether he planned to be friendly or stern. And I knew only too well how stern Dad could be. I sat there, anticipating the worst. About an hour later, I spotted Elvis's BMW and saw Elvis and his father emerge from the car. Elvis had come totally prepared. He was wearing his uniform to impress Dad. He knew that the service was their connection, and he played on it. He looked great. He took off his hat and kissed me on the cheek. I asked him and his father in, and led them into our living room, where Elvis fidgeted and seemed for once at a loss for words. "Are your parents here?" he ventured. I could manage only a nod, and he continued, "I know we're a little late, but I had to get cleaned up, and we had some trouble finding the place." I was amused. Imagine Elvis Presley making up excuses. I was now sufficiently aware of his habits to know that it took him 3 hours to change, chat with the boys, enjoy one of Grandma's huge meals, and sign a few autographs along the way. Except when he was working, he had a cavalier attitude toward time. While Vernon settled on the couch, Elvis pointed to our family portraits on the wall and said, "Look here, Daddy. Here's Priscilla with her whole family. I think she looks like her mama. Can't see too much resemblance with her brothers or sister. They're still a little too young. Don't cut your hair, baby. I love it long like this. You're one pretty girl. How'd I happen to run into you? Must be fate." The last few observations were uttered in a whisper to me as my parents came in. Instead of saying hi, as most young men would have done, Elvis put out his hand and said, "Hello, I'm Elvis Presley, and this is my daddy Vernon." It sounded silly to me. They knew who he was, as did the whole world. But Elvis was the perfect gentleman. My father was visibly impressed, and from that moment on, Elvis always addressed him as Captain Beaulieu or Sir. This was characteristic of Elvis, whatever a person's position in life, whether doctor or lawyer, professor or motion picture director. Unless someone were in Elvis's immediate circle, Elvis rarely used first names, even in dealing with people he had known for years. As he once explained to me, "It's simple. They've worked hard to get where they are. Someone should respect them." The conversation with my parents that night was just small talk. Elvis said that he had spent a busy day at the concern, and this led to an exchange about the service. "What did they assign you to over here?" Dad asked, implying that it had better be a solid job if Elvis wanted to take out his daughter. "Sir, right now, I'm basically driving a Jeep for the 4th Armored Division in Bad Neuheim. That can be tough this time of year. You're not kidding, sir. We've had some pretty cold nights out there already. I have to be especially careful. I battle tonsillitis when my resistance gets low, which isn't good for my voice. I guess you're looking forward to going home. Yes, sir. Only 5 more months. Then Elvis asked my parents how they liked being stationed in Germany. Very much, Dad said. We plan on being here for 3 years. There was a sudden silence. Then Dad offered dinner, but Elvis said they didn't have time. I sat attentively, observing Elvis's uneasiness, and remembering his relaxed manner in his own home. He was on his best behavior, and it was endearing. Mother was reserving judgment about this rock and roll star she had professed to dislike so much. I could see that his southern charm was winning her over. Finally, my father got around to explaining to Elvis the Beaulieu dating rules. If he wanted to see me, Elvis had to pick me up and bring me home. Elvis explained that by the time he got off duty, went home, cleaned up, came to Wiesbaden and back, the evening would be gone. Would it be all right if his father could collect me? Dad mulled this over, then expressed his concern. Just what is the intent here? Let's face it, you're Elvis Presley. You have women throwing themselves at you. Why my daughter? Both Elvis and Vernon were caught off guard. Vernon shifted from one side of the chair to the other, probably thinking, "Okay, Elvis, how are you going to get out of this one?" Elvis said, "Well, sir, I happen to be very fond of her. She's a lot more mature than her age, and I enjoy her company. It hasn't been easy for me, being away from home and all. It gets kind of lonely. I guess you might say I need someone to talk to. You don't have to worry about her, Captain. I'll take good care of her." Elvis's honesty disarmed Dad, just as it did my mother. I joined Elvis as he stood, picked up his hat, and added, "Well, sir, we've got a long drive." There was one stipulation. Elvis himself had to bring me home. He agreed, reassuring them that I would be well taken care of, that there were a lot of family members at his house. He could have ridiculed Dad's request, yet he agreed to take me home every night. I was thrilled, but contained my excitement. He really wanted to be with me. The next night, when Elvis brought me home, we parked in front of the pension. He poured out his heart to me, as he would continue to do throughout our time in Germany. He was lonely. He was unsure of how he would be received by his fans when he returned to the States. When he had entered the Army, he had been at the pinnacle of his fame. He had recorded 17 straight million-selling singles and had starred in 4 films, all of which had become box office hits. When Elvis was drafted, there had been talk of him possibly joining the Special Services, where he could have sung and retained some rapport with the public. But Colonel Parker, his manager and RCA, were convinced that he should serve his country as a regular soldier, claiming that the public would respect Elvis as a man if he went in as a buck private. Now Elvis was afraid he might have lost the support of his fans. While we were parked, one of the Fräuleins who lived in the pension passed the car. She greeted me, and then, when she glanced at Elvis, her mouth dropped open in disbelief. Well, that wraps up Chapter 2. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 2 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.